3 years after the devastating February earthquake, the most significant damage to heritage building remains neither fixed nor fallen. The Christchurch Cathedral is a visual reminder of the conflict that battles between heritage advocates and the Anglican Church that wants to take a wrecking ball to it. The future for the cathedral and heritage buildings in the rebuild are the issues for today's guest on Point of View, University of Canterbury professor and heritage author Dr. Ian Lochhead.
Dr. Lochhead, what is the definition of a heritage building?
Well, I like to think of it as being those buildings from the past that we want to take with us into the future. It's the buildings that society has identified as being significant and important for a variety of reasons. And in fact, the Historic Places Act gives us some assistance in that regard. And it talks about buildings that, or places that possess aesthetic, archaeological, architectural, cultural, historical, scientific, social, spiritual, technological, or traditional significance or value. So, in a sense, buildings that encompass all those things that we feel are important, that tell us about where we've come from, and that guide us to where we're going.
Is the age of a building an important defining factor in whether it gets a heritage status?
Well, yes and no. I mean, the Trust's classifications procedure has tended to avoid classifying buildings more recent than 30 years old, but it is a policy decision rather than something that is excluded in the Act. And indeed, we have major heritage buildings that are quite recent. I mean, we've lost heritage buildings like the Lyttelton Tunnel Authority building that was classified as a Group 1 building by the Trust because of its architectural and historical significance. But that building dated from the early 1960s.
So that's the definition from the Historic Places Trust Act. Mm-hmm. But who ultimately decides whether a building actually has heritage values? Is it just the Historic Places Trust?
Well, I mean, in a sense, you could say it's the board of the Historic Places Trust that approves registered historic buildings. But also there is another legislative process under the Resource Management Act that identifies heritage as being of national significance and assigns the task of identifying architectural heritage to regional authorities, city councils, and so on. So those local authorities also have a role in defining what is historically important, what is heritage. But ultimately, I think it's society that ascribes value and significance to buildings, to the people associated with buildings, to the sites where significant events have occurred. So it's something that really we're all involved in. It's not just an authority from on high that says this is heritage. It's something that is socially constructed effectively.
All right, so the placing of value is a societal thing, but the onus of responsibility in terms of upkeep and maintenance, however, presumably falls onto building owners. So who sets the rules or writes the rules around what a building owner, an owner of a heritage building, for example, is required to do or is required not to do, as the case may be?
Well, building owners, of course, must comply with the legislation around buildings, health and safety requirements, the Building Act and so on. But heritage building owners have another level, and again, this primarily comes through the Resource Management Act rather than the Historic Places Act, that places some constraints on what they can or can't do. It might mean, for example, that they can't knock a great hole in the facade to put in picture windows. It might mean, for example, with a Group 1 building in the Christchurch City Plan, at least prior to the earthquakes, that demolition was not an allowed activity. So it does place constraints, but it also means that the owners of heritage buildings can apply for assistance from city councils, from the Lotteries Grants Board, for example, and of course, since the earthquakes, the Heritage Fund that was set up to assist building owners. Of course, there's never enough money for all the requirements, but at the same time, heritage buildings have their own unique value that can appeal to certain kinds of activities going on in those buildings. So it's not as if it's only a burden. And we've seen, not only in Christchurch, but elsewhere in New Zealand, elsewhere in the world, where heritage is actually a positive benefit for building owners in terms of attracting people to the activities that are going on in those areas.
Do you think the right people own heritage buildings? Because in Christchurch it seems as though, particularly post-quake, that quite a number of owners, and I'm generalising here obviously, but quite a number of owners of heritage buildings have been very quick to declare them unsafe, or to say that they are unsafe and they need to come down, and off they've gone. It does kind of raise the question, well, why did they own heritage buildings in the first place?
Well, I think it's probably fair to say there are good owners of heritage buildings and bad owners of heritage buildings, just as there are responsible building owners and less responsible building owners. There have been the Christchurch owners of heritage buildings that were desperate to restore buildings, but found that the obstacles that were put in their way post-quake made it impossible for them to do what was necessary to retain their buildings. Some of the owners, the KP Rothschild group that owns Ballins Building in High Street, have done a tremendous job prior to the earthquake strengthening that building, but post-earthquake further repairing it and further strengthening it. So it was one of the first buildings in High Street that was back in action after the quakes.
Given the number of heritage buildings that have fallen by the wayside, has the Historic Places Trust done enough, in your opinion, to actually be an advocate for heritage buildings? I mean, allowing for the fact that obviously we're in extraordinary circumstances post-quake, but as the organisation tasked with the responsibility of being an advocate for heritage buildings, have they done enough?
Well, I think the Historic Places Trust was in a very difficult situation. I mean, they were vigorously advocating for heritage, but they were confronted with a government authority, Civil Defence in the first instance, SERA subsequently, that really wasn't required to take account of their views. They consulted to a degree, but in the end, they had there was no requirement for them to actually respond to what the Historic Places Trust was saying. So in many cases, the Trust was arguing that buildings could be retained, and SERA simply said that building can be demolished. Heritage protection comes under the Resource Management Act, and of course those provisions of the Resource Management Act that provided protection for heritage in the Christchurch City Plan were simply set aside by the SERA legislation. So effectively there was no protection for heritage post-quake. Although it was effectively two modern buildings that caused the greatest number of deaths in the earthquakes, what people saw on television, what in many cases people experienced in the streets of Christchurch, were older buildings failing, particularly the facades detaching from the rest of the structure. Very few older buildings failed catastrophically.
Immediately after the earthquakes, a lot of old buildings were characterised as being dangerous old dungers that needed to come down. And yet, when we think about it, more people died in the CTV building than died in any old heritage buildings. So why do you suppose it is that people accepted the argument that old buildings were unsafe and therefore had to be demolished?
Well, I think the term itself, old dungers, was extremely unfortunate. It effectively, as you say, characterised all old buildings as unsafe and having no future in Christchurch. And I think it's also important to remember that immediately after the quakes, and really for months, and I think you could probably say years, people were traumatised by those events. And although it was effectively two modern buildings that caused the greatest number of deaths in the earthquakes, what people saw on television, what in many cases people experienced in the streets of Christchurch, were older buildings failing, particularly the facades detaching from the rest of the structure. Very few older buildings failed catastrophically. It was the facades detaching and falling into the streets that caused much loss of life and injury. But I think we need to look at that in a wider context. We've known for more than 70 years since the Napier earthquake how unreinforced masonry buildings behave in a violent earthquake. We've had more than 70 years to deal with this problem, yet over and over again we've avoided the issue by extending the deadlines for building owners to secure facades, to strengthen their buildings, to take the steps that we knew were necessary. And following the September 2010 quake, it's rather conveniently forgotten. All the emphasis was on getting the city back up and running again, rather than being absolutely certain that there were buildings in the streets of Christchurch that weren't going to provide a hazard in a further major aftershock.
Sarah's recovery strategy calls for an economic recovery program and I think it's a heritage buildings program. Now, the economic recovery program has been around for, I think, 2 years. I think it might even have predated the main recovery strategy itself. The heritage program is actually still being developed. It still hasn't even been finalised. I think it's still out for consultation even as we speak. What does that say to you about the importance placed on heritage?
Well, the Heritage Recovery Plan was first intimated in the draft Sarah Recovery Plan that came out in the middle of 2011, and a draft scoping document was supposed to appear in October of 2011. I saw a very sketchy document in December of 2011, but we didn't actually see the draft Heritage Recovery Program, as it's now termed, and I think it's important to note the change of terminology because a plan has the force of legislation. A program is something that is rather wishy-washy and aspirational. That was released before Christmas 2013 with submissions due in March 2014. So over 3 years since the February 22nd event. That, I think, tells its own story. Heritage is really not a priority for government.
So why does it matter if we have heritage buildings around us or not?
We need people to gain an appreciation of what heritage can provide. It's recognised as being important in tourism terms, but I think ultimately we want to retain heritage for what its value is to us as a nation. As I said earlier on, it represents those things from the past that we value and we want to take with us into the future. The recognition of heritage as something that was important coincided with the emergence of nation states in the 19th century and the whole process of nation building, of national identity, of a sense of valuing who we are. And I think there is a very negative view of heritage as something that is only concerned with the past. But heritage is really as much about the future as it is about the past, because it represents those things that we've seen as being valuable, that we recognise as important achievements, that we want to continue to recognise in the future. I think the history around the Treaty House at Waitangi is very indicative of an extremely lackadaisical attitude towards heritage in New Zealand. In the early 1930s, that building was falling into ruin. It was purchased by the then Governor-General, Lord Bledisloe, because he recognised that this was a significant building in terms of New Zealand's heritage. And he gave it to the people of New Zealand. It took an Englishman, a Governor-General, to recognise something that all New Zealanders should have been cognizant of, should have been aware of, as something that was absolutely critical in terms of our history as a nation. And sometimes when I look at attitudes towards heritage, I feel we haven't really advanced since the 1930s. People coming into what I like to call Heritage Central, Shop 7 in Cathedral Junction, where Historic Places Canterbury have set up displays. People are coming in there from all around the world, and they're horrified at what has happened to the heritage buildings of this city. They're horrified at the prospect that Christchurch Cathedral may be demolished. They simply cannot understand what seems to be a prevailing attitude towards heritage. I find it almost inconceivable that the Anglican Church in Christchurch could be contemplating the demolition of that particular building. That government could be aiding and abetting the church in this process, because it is one of the most recognised buildings in New Zealand from both a national and also an international point of view.
No discussion about heritage buildings can be complete without at least talking a bit about the Anglican Cathedral, Christchurch Cathedral. You're the author of the definitive book on Mountford, who was the supervising architect for the Christchurch Cathedral, who also designed Canterbury Museum and the Arts Centre. Does it pain you to see the threat of demolition hanging over the cathedral and to see it in such a grim state?
Well, it does, and I find it almost inconceivable that the Anglican Church in Christchurch could be contemplating the demolition of that particular building. That government could be aiding and abetting the church in this process, because it is one of the most recognised buildings in New Zealand from both a national and also an international point of view. It's a building that had the hearts and souls of the founders of Canterbury poured into it. It was a building that was created by the common effort of Canterbury in the 19th century. Not just Anglicans, but people from throughout the Canterbury community. And it's a building that has more than just a religious significance to this place. It's almost a civic building in that it's been the site of many significant public events, quite apart from its place in the religious life of the community. And it has brought people from all denominations and indeed all faiths into that building. So We know that from the research of internationally respected engineers that it's a building that can be repaired and made absolutely safe for use, and we can know it can be done for a cost that is probably no more, possibly less than the building of a new cathedral. So it just seems like a no-brainer to me, and I think there are many other people that see this in exactly the same way, not just in New Zealand but internationally. As I travel, I encounter people who say, why aren't you restoring your cathedral? They just don't understand. Well, I think we've already damaged our reputation as the guardians of our heritage from an international perspective. We've rejected offers of assistance from international bodies like Blue Shield for reasons that I simply cannot fathom. International experts in heritage conservation offered their assistance following the quakes, and those were just ignored or rejected. And I think the demolition of Christchurch Cathedral would just cap that off, that it would signal New Zealand as being a society that simply doesn't value its heritage. I think it's also important to remember that George Gilbert Scott, the architect of Christchurch Cathedral, is an internationally recognised figure in 19th century architecture. He was one of the superstars, to use the modern terminology, of the Gothic revival of 19th century architecture. And Scott's buildings in Britain, buildings like the Grand Midland Hotel, which forms the frontispiece for St Pancras Station, is now one of the most admired buildings in Britain. It's Britain's gateway to the continent. It's a fabulous building. People think it's tremendous. And then when they see Christchurch and New Zealand preparing to demolish a Scott building, they find it extremely puzzling. I think it's also worth mentioning that Scott was probably the first architect of whom it could be said, like the British Empire, the sun never set on his buildings. He had buildings all round the globe. If we demolish our cathedral here in Christchurch, it diminishes that international collection of Scott buildings. But it also diminishes our own collection of really significant Gothic revival buildings. I think it's important for us to recognise that the cathedral forms part of a grouping of buildings that gives Christchurch a particular distinction. The museum, which is opposite down the length of Worcester Boulevard, the buildings of the Arts Centre, Christ's College, the provincial council buildings that no doubt will be restored, and the timber Gothic churches around Canterbury, St Michael and All Angels as well. Now that set is an absolutely extraordinary group of colonial Gothic revival buildings, and the cathedral is a key component of that. If you remove the cathedral, you diminish all the rest of them.